Hi everyone and welcome to OCR History B, the Elizabethans 1580 to 1603. This first content video is going to cover our first theme of Elizabeth and her government. So to ensure that you can answer your Elizabethan questions correctly, you need to have some background knowledge on Elizabeth to enable you to do this. So we're going to start off by looking at her family. So just a reminder that she was the second daughter of Henry VIII. Mary I, or Bloody Mary, was obviously the first daughter. Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, who was his second wife, and therefore many Catholics in England believed that she was illegitimate, so she didn't have a right to the throne, which would cause Elizabeth problems when she did ascend to the throne. We have Edward VI, who was her brother, and Mary I, as I said, Bloody Mary, who was her sister. Just a reminder that Edward was also a Protestant and Mary was a Catholic. In terms of religion, Henry VIII, Elizabeth's dad, created the Church of England and the branch of Christianity in England known as Protestantism. We had Edward VI, who I've already said was a Protestant, Mary I, who was a devout Catholic, and Elizabeth I, who was a moderate Protestant. So this means that she was quite accepting of both sides. She was more fair than her sister and her brother. In terms of her path to power, she was educated to the highest standards and she was largely supported as heir to Mary I. So even though we've said that Mary was a Catholic and Elizabeth was a Protestant, the vast majority of Britain agreed that Elizabeth was next in line to the throne and should take the throne. She was the final Tudor monarch and she becomes queen on the 17th of November 1558. So remember, she's the final Tudor monarch because she dies with the label of the Virgin Queen. She never married and she never had any children. In terms of society, we have what's known as the Great Chain of Being, which outlines our hierarchy for Elizabethan England. So we have the nobility, the gentry, the yeomen and the labourers. The majority of the population lived in rural areas or countryside, and therefore their jobs were involved in agriculture or farming. And the population during this time period is rapidly increasing, and this means that there was more competition for work. It also means that fewer people had access to large amounts of money, and this didn't help when we had increased rent and food prices. More people were travelling in search of work as a result of the fact that there was more competition for jobs due to the increase in population. Roads were beginning to improve, and there was lots of famine and poor harvests, and we just spoke about food prices rising, and that's the cause of that. So the less you have of something, the more pricey it becomes, and sadly for the Elizabethans, food was impacted massively from the fact that there was poor harvests and famine. And finally, finances. So the Elizabethans were in a bad situation in terms of poverty. There was lots of inflation, which meant that poverty was increasing. And therefore, there was a pressure to increase taxation to try and raise funds to help with this financial situation. So just a little bit of background there that's going to set the scene for all of the modules that we look at, starting with Elizabeth and her government. So we're going to start off by having a look at Elizabeth's royal court. So the first thing to remember is that the court is not a place, but a group of selected people who surrounded the Queen. So we have the Privy Council and the Privy Chamber as part of the royal court. And as I've said, they are mobile. It's not a set place. So they follow the Queen throughout England on her travels. And this is really the hub of power in Elizabethan England. This is where you needed to be if you were going to get noticed and you were going to have influence. At the Elizabethan court, we have things like trials, foreign diplomats, so foreign politicians who came over to see Elizabeth and to create treaties, etc. We have banquets, we have dancing, we have companies of actors. Remember, Elizabeth never actually visits the theatre herself, but she loves performances and asks companies of actors to come to her at court. So, for example, the Lord Chamberlain's men. It's a propaganda to glorify the Queen. So remember, propaganda, making people think in a certain way, and the court's kind of image really boosts Elizabeth in terms of the way that she appears to the people, to look powerful, to look strong, to look like a decisive leader. In terms of patronage, remember that is land, money and titles in return for loyalty. She gives this out a lot at court, and it creates factional rivalries between gentry families. Now, Elizabeth does this on purpose in something called divide and rule, which is where she would ensure that members of competing gentry families would work together in the hope that they would try to outdo one another to prove that they were more loyal to Elizabeth. So she didn't want groups of people ganging together against her. She wants to keep them competitive against one another in the hope that they would gain the most favour from her. In summer then, Elizabeth and her court went on what were known as royal progresses or tours of the country. This is to enable as many of the Elizabethans to see her as possible, and she would stay with nobles in these different areas and allow people to see her. And the idea behind all of this is to boost the impression of royal power. Council then, and first of all their role. So the Privy Councillors are male, and they were often courtiers. So as we said, the Privy Council and the Privy Chamber were part of the Elizabethan court. So these Privy Councillors were often courtiers as well. They advised her on taxes, gentry disputes and patronage, remember land, money and titles in return for loyalty, and they met at court almost daily, reinforcing their significance. In terms of key members that you need to know about, William Cecil was Secretary of State between 1558 and 1572, and then again between 1590 and 1598, and he was a moderate Protestant, the same as Elizabeth. So he didn't have extreme religious views. He was willing to suppress Catholics, however, more than the Queen was. He avoided foreign religious disputes, and he did challenge Elizabeth, but he was loyal. Remember, we will come to this in a subsequent video, but remember, it is William Cecil who has the ear of Elizabeth when he persuades her to execute Mary, Queen of Scots. So that is a really good piece of evidence that proves that he was more willing to suppress Catholics, and that he did challenge Elizabeth's decision. We also have Francis Walsingham, who was Secretary of State between 1572 and 1590. He was a strong Puritan, so he was very eager to repress the Catholics in a much harsher way than Elizabeth was. He was also known as her spy master, and it was said that he had eyes and ears everywhere. There was a distance between him and Elizabeth at times, and he did argue with the Queen once, so quite a brave man, but one of her closest advisors. We then have Robert Dudley, who was in a close friendship with Elizabeth, and they were rumoured to have had affairs. He could never have been a serious candidate for Elizabeth to marry as a result of the fact that his social class wasn't high enough, and he was also married to somebody else who then died in quite mysterious circumstances. In 1585 he commanded the army in the Netherlands. So you can see there are three key members that would be good to reference in the exam, particularly William Cecil and Francis Walsingham though. And finally, in terms of background, we have 19 members that make up the Privy Council. She only ever has 7 or 8 present at each meeting. Remember, we spoke about this idea of divide and rule, which is the second point you can see. She appointed members with different viewpoints so that they wouldn't conspire against her and so that she would receive different advice. So she wants to make sure that there is a friction almost between the members of her Privy Council. So again, this idea that they are competing to stay loyal to her, and they have her as their #1 priority. She also offered patronage, remember land, money and titles in return for loyalty to her councillors, to the people that guided her. So the Privy Councillors are male, very significant advisors to Elizabeth, and they meet with her pretty much every day. So in terms of Parliament, just a reminder here that Parliament does not operate the same way it does today. It's not democratic, so it's a very different Parliament to the one that we hear about so often. So just bear that in mind. So first of all, the role. So there are 2 houses, the same as today, but it's now a different system. But we have the House of Commons, which is made up of the gentry, and the House of Lords, which was made up of nobles and bishops. They were not elected. As we said, it is not democratic. These are the wealthiest and most powerful people in England at the time. We can see a statistic here which is really important for you to know in the exam and really reinforces perhaps the lack of value that Elizabeth gives to Parliament, because they only met 13 times within Elizabeth's 45-year reign, and that was only because she needed them for very specific things such as raising taxes or changing laws. So if she wanted to do either of those things, she had to meet Parliament, and that was the only reason that they were called. She did need them more between 1580 and 1603 due to law changes and needing more money for fighting the Catholics in Spain. Remember, we have the Spanish Armada in 1588. And Elizabeth rules predominantly through something called Royal Proclamation, which has the force of law, but is only for new laws. So how does she keep control? She dismisses any of the parliaments that she doesn't want. If they are speaking about things that she has banned, for example, she will just dismiss them. MPs were selected and not elected, so remember it's not democratic, and that means Elizabeth can decide who she wants to be a member of Parliament or an MP. And the Privy Council organised the daily business of Parliament. So remember, Elizabeth's Privy Councillors are her closest advisors. So by enabling them to organise the daily business of Parliament, it's hoped that this would limit the chance for discussion against Elizabeth's wishes. So she has a lot of control over her Parliament. In terms of criticisms that Parliament had, they were not fans of purveyances, which was the Queen's right to buy cheap supplies, and they didn't like monopolies either, which gave exclusive rights to certain MPs to make or sell a product, which means that they made huge amounts of money. These were criticised repeatedly by MPs or members of Parliament. The Queen ignored these criticisms until 1601, 2 years before she died, where she made her golden speech promising to cancel some, again perhaps suggesting that towards the end of her reign her power was not quite as strong. So in terms of local government, remember Elizabeth spent the majority of her time in London or the surrounding areas, and as a result of that she had to rely on different people around the country to keep the English people loyal to her. So firstly we have Lord Lieutenants, so they controlled the local militia, the local armed forces. They would report back to Elizabeth on the behaviour of JPs or Justice of the Peace. They would inform the parish constables of important issues. Which is a small area with the church, and she would also ensure that these Lord Lieutenants were wealthy nobles, people that she felt that she could trust. We also had a sheriff who dealt with legal affairs. They appointed juries, collected taxes, and they were again wealthy noblemen or gentlemen. So we can really see in terms of the great chain of being, all of these positions of power are held by people who have come from very affluent backgrounds. We then have the JPs or Justice of the Peace. There were around 40 per county. They were responsible for maintaining the local law, and they ran quarter session courts, which were courts that didn't deal with the most serious cases of crimes, but they met 4 times a year, and the cases that they did deal with were still pretty severe as crimes. So they do have a big responsibility for local law. They also oversaw the poor law, which we will come to in a different content video. Remember, that was a tax rate that was collected from people in society to help support the poorest. And again, they were educated and wealthy gentlemen. So again, she is selecting from the top of the chain of being. We then had the parish constable who policed taverns or pubs. He went on night watches, so he was looking out for vagrants, remember people that were roaming the country without a job or a home, and they were unpaid, so they were held by tradesmen or farmers, these positions. So the first example we've seen of somebody that isn't from the upper classes. And finally we have the overseers of the poor. These are the people who ensure that the poor rate as part of the poor law in 1601 has been collected, and then they ensure that that is distributed as it should be. First of all, Elizabeth tried to limit the freedom of speech that people had. So MPs or members of Parliament could not speak about religion, marriage, foreign affairs and succession. They were all topics that were banned. Elizabeth also used what was known as her royal veto, which was to stop any laws being passed that she didn't like. So she has control over the laws of her country. Puritans were desperate for freedom of speech, and they demanded this for any members of Parliament. But 2 Puritans were hanged in 1583 for suggesting this, which really does reinforce how strict Elizabeth could be with her punishments, and this would have been used as a deterrent to stop anybody else requesting this. In November 1593, I'm sure you'll remember the case study of John Stubbs, whose hand was cut off for writing a Puritan pamphlet which criticised Elizabeth's proposed marriage to the Duke of Anjou, who was a French Catholic. So this was again done in public, and the idea here was to deter anybody else criticising her in the same way. Also in 1593, we have the Puritan MP Peter Wentworth, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London for urging Elizabeth to name a Protestant successor, which, remember, is one of those topics that Elizabeth had banned in Parliament. In terms of Puritan opposition, the Puritans wanted Elizabeth to marry a Protestant prince to ensure that she could have Protestant heirs, so that the line of succession could continue and the Tudor dynasty could continue, but most importantly in their eyes, in Protestant hands. They also wanted her to change how the church was organised, and they wanted to select their own bishops. Despite these 2 points, though, it's really important to remember that they, as much as they are more extreme in terms of their Protestant beliefs than Elizabeth, they are Protestants, and therefore they do not want to remove her as queen. The Catholics were always more of a threat to Elizabeth than the Puritans were. We then have the Essex Rebellion, which is in 1601. So the Earl of Essex was one of Elizabeth's favourites, but he decided to defy the Queen in 1589 by joining Drake's failed attack on Lisbon and marrying without permission. So this angers Elizabeth greatly. Essex was also annoyed that he was not Secretary of State after Cecil's death. It was given to Robert Cecil instead, and he felt like he was a worthy candidate for that job. Elizabeth sent Essex to Ireland in 1599 to defeat a Catholic rebellion, but instead of doing this, Essex makes a truce with the Catholics, and he also knights some of the Catholic rebels, which really angers Elizabeth, and as a result of this, she bans him from court in 1600 and removes his monopoly and his job. So this would have been a huge insult to Essex and would have caused great anger, and this really was the catalyst for the rebellion, which takes place in 1601. So in 1601, Essex marched on London with 200 supporters. 200 obviously not a vast number, it was always likely to be unsuccessful, but it clearly shows that one of Elizabeth's favourite had the confidence to go against her. Despite this, he was labelled a traitor publicly, so those 200 followers quickly abandoned him. He was arrested and he was executed in 1601, which really does show the power of Elizabeth. So if you had a 20-mark question which was speaking about the power of the Queen, you could put the Essex Rebellion on either side of the argument, either to show that Elizabeth perhaps wasn't as strong because there was a rebellion against her, but also the fact that for the other side of the argument, the opposing side, that she dealt with threats like this very, very well. So she was very strong in her punishment of Essex, and once again, this would be a deterrent for anybody else that was considering a rebellion. And finally, we have the idea of how did Elizabeth maintain her control, and she used 2 main methods for this. The first was censorship. So Elizabeth saw plans for plays in advance to cut anything out that she did not like. There were only 60 printing presses in England, which really limited the number of publications that could be circulated, ensuring that nothing negative was written about Elizabeth. And the Privy Council were in charge of ensuring that any publications were acceptable. Images for portraits were heavily controlled. So, for example, the 1596 painting had a new template for artists to copy, which showed Elizabeth to be much younger and to hide her decaying teeth and her wig. So she appears much younger in this portrait than she does in some of the ones where she is actually much younger. So this really does show that her image has been censored. She is ensuring that it's only positive messages that are getting out about her. And the Privy Council burnt unacceptable portraits. So Yeah, I guess the template for the artist was the Elizabethan version of the Instagram filter. So as a result of this, she ensures that she only appears the way that she wants to in portraits, which was very important for her to control the way the English people saw her. We also then have propaganda. So we spoke about progresses, which remember were these tours around the country in the summer months, and this ensured that Elizabeth could be seen by her people. We also had plays, which were performed at court, showing the importance of the monarchy and the hierarchy. Publications, such as books which were published on topics such as Elizabeth's Golden Speech in 1601, which aimed to flatter the Queen. Portraits. The Queen commissioned portraits of her looking young, as we've spoken about, for example, the rainbow portrait. She expected courtiers to wear many portraits of her, and courtiers also commissioned portraits to flatter Elizabeth. Pennies were the main way that people saw Elizabeth, and as a result of this, the image on there was one that was favourable to her, because this is the only way that the vast majority of the population would have ever seen or had any idea what the Queen looked like. We have prayers, so we had services which included prayer for the Queen's memory, which reinforced Elizabeth's position as God's divinely appointed ruler. Remember, as part of that great chain of being, God has appointed Elizabeth, and there is a constant reminder of that in prayers. And also in terms of preaching, the preachers had to get government licenses to enable them to preach, and the Queen only selects church leaders to preach who would spread messages of loyalty and positive messages about Elizabeth. So propaganda and censorship, both very important ways that Elizabeth maintained control of the English people and of her government more generally. So the next content video for the Elizabethans will be centred on Catholics.